For those of you who've joined us in these conversations before, welcome back. For those of you for whom this is the first of your conversations on innovation and inclusion, welcome and thank you for joining us. My name's Fiona Murray. I'm the Associate Dean for Innovation and Inclusion at MIT Sloan. And in that work, I'm joined by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Ray Reagans, who's the Associate Dean for DEI. We really appreciate your joining us at the Sloan School of Management as we continue our series of action-oriented conversations on building an inclusive innovation economy. By way of motivation, Ray and I have the privilege and quite daunting task of working with our entire community to build a more diverse, equitable and inclusive place at Sloan. And we focus on going from unconscious bias to conscious inclusion. A lot of our work is inward facing, of course, shaping and building the constructive culture that we want to have inside Sloan and within MIT. But we know we're not an island. And so every day we know that we have to confront some really complicated challenges of DEI, whether it's manifest here in Kendall Square in Cambridge, in Greater Boston, throughout Massachusetts and beyond in the United States. We also know that we're not alone as an academic community, but that in fact we are there to engage with the wider set of stakeholders, whether it be with the government, with large corporations, with entrepreneurs, with other universities, but in particular with risk capital and with capital, and the way in which money flows around our economy so significantly shapes the kinds of opportunities that will shape who gets to come to a place like MIT, what they can do when they leave, but also so much further, the kind of lives and opportunities that people have to participate in the innovation economy. And it's really that set of conversations that we're trying to have to focus our learning journey. And this is a learning journey that we hope includes our staff and our students, as well as our faculty, and with many on the outside whom we can learn from. We want to focus on inclusion of underrepresented communities, Black and Brown entrepreneurs, innovators from African American and Latinx communities. Other dimensions of diversity matter to all of us, but this is our particular focus at the moment. As we begin our live conversation, there are just a couple of things that I want to remind everybody. Each session gives us an opportunity to dive deeply into different ways of thinking about inclusion in the innovation economy. And in particular, the action steps that we can take to make a difference within our own sphere of influence and also try to influence the actions and support the actions of others. We really hope this is a chance to build a community of inclusive, innovative leaders, very much along the lines of MIT Management School's principles and mission. And I do again want to note that this conversation includes our alumni, staff, students, and faculty. And that in and of itself is already special, not having separate conversations, but being part of one conversation. Another piece of this is inviting people in from our community whom we can learn from. We have so much to learn. And so we want to be in the business of listening as much as telling other people what to do and learning alongside all of you. And so we really welcome your input and ideas, your contributions. Please ask us questions. Please make sure you engage with our speakers and in our conversation. And in having these conversations, I'm incredibly pleased that we've been joined at MIT School of Management by Malia Lazu. Malia has joined us. She joined at the beginning of the semester as a lecturer and is very much now part of our community and the leader of these discussions. She's a great conversationalist, as those of you who know her already know, incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking. And so with that, Malia, let me hand over to you and ask you to take us into this conversation.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And it is great to be here again with all of you. Those who have joined us before, I hope you are enjoying this series and the way we are having these conversations. We will be having a set of them next year as well. So don't you worry that there'll be more coming next year. But we really wanted to end the year with the conversation that so many folks start with. And we heard last time from Natalie when she talked about that women are actually receiving less investment than they did 20 years ago, and that we aren't necessarily getting better, although we are talking about it more. And so we thought it was important to talk to folks who sit in capital and who think about how to get resources to WMBE, women and minority owned business ventures. And we have two people here today who are doing just that. I want to introduce both Barbara Clarke and Quincy Miller. And these are two leaders in the capital space that truly put their money where their mouth is. Barbara Clarke is a lead investor in Portfolia's Rising Tide, Portfolio Enterprise Fund, and Portfolio First Step Fund. Barbara led the Rising Tide investments at Renovo RX and co-led investments in Tenacity and Poshly. Barbara is a prolific early stage investor in Boston and the Northeast. She is exclusively backing women-led, people of color, and LGBTQ-led companies. She was also an early investor in Portfolio. And let me kick it to Quincy as well, who is Quincy Miller, the president and vice chairman of Eastern Bank. Quincy, the oldest and Quincy isn't the oldest, but the bank is the oldest and largest mutual in the United States. He spends his time focusing on helping leading the overall strategic direction of Eastern, which has served its customers and colleagues and communities for nearly 200 years. Quincy is the former president of Citizens Bank, Massachusetts, and the president of its business banking division. The foundation of his career is rooted in consumer banking, where he developed a passion for leading from the front line, ensuring that his perspective is guided by the colleagues closest to the community. Proximity. Both Barbara and Quincy can talk a lot about that. Thank you so much for joining us, you two. We truly appreciate it. And let's just jump right in. And Barbara, I would love to start with you. When people hear, and when I'm talking about your work at Impact Seed and others, and I talk about that you fund women-led POC LGBTQ startups, they say, oh, in part of her, in part of her company, what else does she do? It's hard for people to think about woman-led POC fund. And so I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about why you got there, how you got there, and also maybe tell us some myths that you bust on a daily.
So just to pick up on what Fiona said in her opening comments, where, the goal here, what MIT is trying to do is to move from unconscious bias to conscious action, because I think that's really my story. I'm a technology investor. I love, super early technology, a whole variety of different areas. And if you just jump right into sort of the mainstream, like this is how we fund early stage companies, you end up with a lot of deal flow that is companies that are all white male teams. And that's when I said, well, no, first of all, this is a great audience to talk about. There's math. We know that women are getting the majority of bachelor's, and in so many areas of STEM, we're getting the majority of PhDs in things like academic medicine, biology. And then we look at, we're getting the majority of, advanced degrees. And then if we look specifically at different demographics within women, the most educated category of women is Black women. If you see two women on the street, a white woman and a Black woman, that Black woman is much more likely to have an advanced degree than the white woman. So that's a nice myth to bust. So anyways, and so, I said, well, how do I actually change the structure? And so what I did over time, I realized if I want to invest in the world I want to see, which is I want to see a nice, diverse CEO population. I have to be intentional. And I said, well, why don't I center women of color and men of color in my investing? I'm going to look for companies that have those characteristics on their founding team, and then everything will flow out from there. And so that's what I started to do. And one of the myths is that, there aren't these companies, which again is crazy because the fastest growing population of entrepreneurs is Black women in particular. started companies in the past, I think 2 to 3 years, they've started growing companies faster than anybody else. So it's math. Like, so if whatever you're doing, when you're looking at early stage companies, if you're not seeing women, if you're not seeing people of color, there's something completely wrong with your process, because mathematically, it's difficult to actually fund all white male teams without bias.
I love that. I love that. And it's so important to remember that the numbers are in our favor. So if you can't find any, you may actually be trying not to, right? Because you should be able to find some. Quincy, I want to move to you. And we know, I mean, as much as we talk about early stage investment and companies that get investment, what we also know is that 90 something, right, percent of small businesses start with bank loans, right? Start with more traditional debt capital. And that really puts banks, in a powerful place to support WMBEs. And Eastern Bank has really decided that you guys were going to put your stake in the ground and make sure that you were supporting Black and Brown businesses, launching the Foundation for Business Equity, and helping launch Pacesetters and other initiatives. So I would love for you to just talk about how the bank got there. It's not something that a lot of banks do, and I would say that some banks are now starting to follow you, but you guys really have been leading in this area for several years now. So can you tell us how you got there as a bank, and how the journey has been?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to, and happy to be here with all of you. So it's a long story. I'll try to make it short, but I have to start in 1818. But literally 1818 was the year Eastern was founded, when there was no national banking system, and when, quite frankly, women weren't allowed to even have bank accounts. So Eastern was one of the first banks in the entire country. It was founded by wealthy philanthropists, as you can imagine, who had all the capital at the time, who felt that that banking should be more open to the common people. And so, in fact, I think 75% of our first customers that first year were all women when Eastern was founded. And so, you now sort of fast forward, you see sort of the history of Eastern's commitment to the underserved and underrepresented. Our focus, or really outsized focus around small businesses, really came out of the financial crisis of the Great Recession. When most banks stopped lending to small businesses, Eastern stepped in because we saw small businesses as a lifeblood to our communities. And that really set off the path of us being the largest SBA small business administrator lender in all of New England. Although we're just, a fraction of the size of most of our competitors across this footprint. And so that was really that motivation. And so I guess it was now 5.5 years ago, as we were, 8 years past that moment, we were thinking about how do we take what we do with small business to the next level. And made perfect sense for us to connect that with another passion of ours, which was the support of our communities, economic inclusion. And at the time, as many of you probably know, the report had come out that highlighted that Boston had the greatest wealth gap in the entire country. Many of you have heard it. Most of you all have heard it, right? $247,000 average net worth of a white family in Greater Boston. The Latino family, the number was approximately $1,700. And for a Black family, $8. And so our thought as a bank was what role could we play in this? And we decided to make an incremental investment in specifically supporting Black and Latinx businesses. And we chose that, which for us was, and even many people in the community were a little surprised that we were so purposeful, given how inclusive that we focus and our focus is. But the answer was that wealth gap, Black and Latinx had the largest wealth gap. And if we're not very intentional, we're not going to be able to change it. And so through that, we decided to make from our foundation an initial investment of $10 million to start a new foundation dedicated completely to helping these businesses scale. So completely focused on Black and Latinx businesses, and bringing our expertise from the bank, but also bringing the community aspect to it together. And what we knew was, and there's lots of programs, as many of you know, to support small businesses. But what we knew was we wanted to try to create an ecosystem. So the capacity building is very critical. And I'll talk about that in a second. But you got to build capacity with these businesses. But capacity in of itself, without anywhere to be able to take advantage of that capacity, doesn't take your business anywhere. And so we knew we wanted capacity. We wanted to build contracts. How did you create revenue opportunities? And then also obviously capital, which we're here to talk about today. And so most of our 10 million, a lot of the 10 million, I would say most, went into the capacity building program to work with Black and Latinx businesses over a long term, which had not really been done before, 12 to 18 months embedded in the business with strategic advisors who could help them grow their business, together with partnering with the chamber and really driving the launch of the Pacesetters program, which is designed around supplier diversity and minority procurement. And so we funded the chamber because no one was, no one's got all these companies, big companies across Boston. They weren't going to listen to Eastern when we said, hey, you need to work more on supplier diversity. So we went to Jim Rooney in the chamber and said, why don't you carry this flag for us? And so we seeded the launch and continue to support that program. And then the final piece around capital was we took $2 million of that $10 million initially and seeded it with the Boston Foundation to help create a loan fund for these companies, which has now expanded and grown and brought in other partners as aspects to it. So, and over this last 4 years, I guess, we've now served 50 companies just through the capacity program, through that process that I just described. These are all larger businesses with typical revenues of at least $750,000 a year or more. We were purposeful in that decision as well, because the goal was to have a company with the scale to be able to create meaningful, life-sustaining wage jobs in the community. And so those companies were large enough to do that. The other thing was to help to build wealth through the business owners, their growth. And then final goal was to be able to help change the face of leadership across Boston by empowering and helping these business owners grow, and then ultimately taking on leadership positions and boards, et cetera. That's the shortest I could make it, Malia.
No, that was great. That was great. And what I like about it is the holistic approach, right? So often we hear that people, we're gonna try to do something with WMBEs, and then that's the intention and that's all they do, and they don't actually really try to understand where the WMBEs are. And what I heard from both of you is that you understand that context, right? That you understand that they're not going to look like these typical white businesses or, white male-led startups, Ivy League startups, all this kind of stuff. But there still is a due diligence process. There are things you can go to make sound investments. And I think that that's really what we want to get out for people to understand. Barbara, when it comes to access to capital, how can banks and VC firms demonstrate effective support for a more diverse and inclusive group of entrepreneurs? What are some standards that we can start setting cross industry to demonstrate our support?
Well, I mean, the simple thing is to just do it. Like, just write the check, stop doing diversity theater where you hold special sessions, for people of color that, you talk about how much you like them and, oh, we really want to help. And then you don't write the checks, you don't do anything. So I think action, like, I have such a bias to action. My goal is not just, let me just see what companies are out there. No, my bias is I need to invest in these companies because this is how, as an investment fund, this is how we make money, is we invest in great companies that then return a profit to us. And so I'm actively looking. And so there's a lot of diversity here out there where, you know, folks are just talking to, or they set up side programs. I get really frustrated when I hear about an accelerator or any kind of program that is like, now we're going to do this special program for people of color. I'm like, no, fix the main part of your business, which is so say you're an accelerator, why is your accelerator not diverse? You've got systemic things going on with your program. The other thing I would also add is access to all kinds of capital, and I think it reiterates what Quincy was saying is, you know, companies have all different types of capital needs. Some of it, maybe it is suited to venture capital, but lots of companies have working capital needs. And they don't have access to that friends and family round. Even I joke, like, friends and family, you mean the people who ask me for money? Like, I don't have this network that can like support me in that way. And also for women and people of color, I haven't been socialized that way. You know, I have lived most of my life not thinking about like, oh, like I'm going to invest in my friends' companies and do all this stuff. That's just not the way I was socialized. So, you know, think about all the different types of capital and how you can access it. Because again, working capital is actually a huge need for small businesses. And a lot of banks, including, you know, some of the programs with the SBA, they are requiring, you know, personal guarantees. Well, if you don't have any assets yourself, what are you going to guarantee it against? So that's why some of the programs that understand that. And then the one other thing I would say is I try to be as aligned with my companies as possible. So that's why, and I do more than just venture-backed. I also do revenue-based financing and I also do working capital lending and things like that. And I want to make sure we're all focused on the same thing. And so, you know, I want to make sure that they really understand what they're using the capital for. Are they using it for the right thing? Do they have the skill set in-house to really understand their financials? Because that's a thing that's very overlooked. As I'm sure, Quincy, I know that that's part of your program, focusing on the financials and making sure these companies have really solid books and records, and then they really understand how to use those tools. So those are a few things.
Absolutely, absolutely, Quincy. I saw you nodding at some of that stuff. Anything to add?
No, I mean, obviously Barbara talked about the financial piece of it. You know, through our work with the advisors and with these companies, you know, can you be surprised? Even $1 million companies that need to improve their financials because they can't tell their story, they don't have their arms around it. And that's again, you know, for many ways to be expected because most business owners are successful at running their business. The financial end, they need some support around. And so there's this level of ecosystem though too. I often, you know, try to remind people from the bank's perspective that, you know, from a risk perspective, we always have to take in consideration, we're lending other people's money. We're not lending our money. You know, we're lending our depositors money who have given us the money that we then lend out. And then we make income on that spread and that difference. And so that's why this ecosystem has to come together. Why, you know, quite frankly, in the fintech space or in just the innovation space, there's a whole VC space because banks aren't really equipped to take that level of risk. Same way it happens with a startup and small business. And so I think, as Barbara mentioned, we then leverage programs like the SBA, who provides a government guarantee to reduce some of that risk to banks so that we can lend and extend even further. But then we bring together the ecosystem, and not just obviously VCs, that's a sliver of it, but the community development corporations that are lending, doing micro lending and startup support. And those may have, slightly higher interest rates than what bank debt does, but it's not, hard money lenders either, where, you're going to get involved in something and then not be able to get out of it. And so part of the challenge with communities of color and businesses of color is understanding who that ecosystem is. And that's really where a bank can play an important role to say, okay, here's what we need to be able to do, provide you capital. If you don't meet those criteria for whatever reason, here are the other sources that you have to actually get you started. And then we partner with many of those, such as Mass Growth Capital. And as those businesses grow, then they'll come over to us. We'll refinance that debt down to a traditional bank rate and continue to foster their growth. So that education and connections is critically important.
Yes, yes. And, ecosystem and understanding the ecosystem, I think is also very important for entrepreneurs, and something that both of you said. Often people think of, oh, I'm going to start a business, so I'm going to get investment and I'm going to get this and I'm going to get that. And one of the things that we know is that you're giving away pieces of your business. You may be giving away all of your business, right? If a VC decides to put in a new CEO because they don't like the returns you're getting. And when we talk about Black and brown businesses, ownership is so important. And so I think finding those balances and us understanding those balances is important as well. I do want to we've gotten some pre-questions from the audience. And so I would like to, while we're talking about this, throw in one of their questions, which is, what type of capital needs to be unlocked for those who have limited access? So we were just talking about all the different capital, the different kinds of capital. Are you guys seeing, that there's is anything developing for people that have limited access, to be able to get that friends and family piece, and get in a little bit if they don't actually have the access or the credit scores or the things needed for more traditional funding?
Well, it's clearly like across the board, there is limited access to capital. And I sort of want to pick up on a point Quincy made, because it's something I'm involved in as well. If you look at, there are so many small businesses in our country that have $750,000 in revenue, maybe even up a couple of $1 million in revenue. They have a really difficult time accessing capital. And you think about that, like, I'm not really interested in some of, like, somebody has an idea and they want to work. I think there's so many things you can do. Folks can do it as a side hustle. They can fund, working on it part-time is great. But what about an actual business that generates $500,000, $750,000? And what can we do to support them? And those are the companies that need maybe not even a lot of cash. Maybe they only need a $25K loan, but they can't get it because they can't do a personal guarantee, or there's something about the way their accounting is, so they need to get in shape. And so I think that it's really important to focus on those kinds of companies, because there are a lot of them around the country. And giving them the tools so they get their fiscal house in order, and then having some programs and I like the visual of like a continuum where, they get some funding, then they pay it back. So now they're starting to build their company's sort of credit history. And then they eventually segue into, proper banking with a line of credit that's at, good competitive market rate. So I think we should really realize that there are loads of companies out there, and they are just starving for capital. And I know there was a question in the chat, not quite, sort of about, like, if you look at this PPP program that, for dealing with COVID, I know so many companies did not have the financial information to quickly apply. They didn't have the banking relations to quickly apply, and they were really left out. We did some research in Boston in the South End about, who applied, who got the money. And, it was only those companies that had good relationships with local banks, these smaller companies, and Eastern Bank was definitely one that was mentioned. that they actually achieved that. So that was this COVID situation, and what we're going to struggle with for the next year, 18 months. It's really highlighted the different access to capital that so many companies have.
And the different technical support. I'm so glad that you brought up the PPP, because, so what the wake up call for us, I think, was seeing that we have businesses that are functioning that have not paid their taxes in 3 years, right? Like there were things, and these are folks who are part of programs, right? They're part of the accelerators for color that you talk about, and no one's checked to see if their taxes are up to date and help them get those done. And I know us at Berkshire Bank, and we saw, I'm sure Quincy saw the same thing at Eastern. I mean, these are companies that we shop at, right? I mean, some of them are known companies of color, and it was just so surprising to see that. Quincy, I'm going to kick that question to you, but also add something around leadership, because, Barbara talked again about how Eastern stepped forward, and, Eastern really has been leading so much of it. It was great to have Eastern when I was at Berkshire, because it was something I could point to be like, well, they're doing it, why can't we? And I would love if you could, just talk about, how do you persuade for-profit banks, right? I mean, how do you sort of take in this, we're all in it together, we're going to work with the chamber? I mean, I know when I was at Berkshire, we worked closely together, right? It wasn't just like, oh, and we're the only bank that's going to do this. You and Bob both say, join us, right? We'll come in. And so how did you convince this for-profit company to let you guys lead in such an open way?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that sort of two ways. So first, it was, again, given our history, it wasn't hard for us at Eastern to do that, right? And actually, it's very just easy. It was more just being strategic, executing it, bringing in the right experts to help us, right? We hired Glenn Lloyd to come in and run the Foundation for Business Equity. Glenn had been originally a business owner. He was a small business owner. Him and his brother started City Fresh Foods. And then Glenn went out on his own after that and was providing capital and doing, at some of these ecosystem lenders that I talked about. So bringing in the right person who had lived it to help us, even as bankers, to think more holistically, how do we make those connections was, I would say, was the one key. But it wasn't a hard sort of to get us to do it. I think as you look at, I'm going to use corporate America in general, and obviously banks fall into this. The financial industry by its nature is not diverse. And I've spent my whole career, and as I've told many people, I have pretty much always been the only person of color in every job I've ever had, right? Now, the reality is, over the last 10 years, that tide has begun to shift very slowly. Although many companies have talked a good game, very few have actually executed a good game. Now, this moment that we're in today is different, right? After the killing of George Floyd and the rising up of the community and saying this can't happen anymore, we have to change. We've obviously all seen more companies than ever before in my lifetime stand up and say, we stand for equity, we stand for Black Lives Matter, we stand for social justice, all kinds of commitments, etc. And so in this moment, it's about the opportunity to capitalize on that and hold companies accountable, particularly banks. And I will tell you, I was at the industry conference for the Consumer Bankers Association earlier this year, and they asked me to speak sort of a quick keynote on this topic. And I am glad to say there was more dialogue from banks around the idea of really driving change in terms of equity, both in inside their four walls and outside their four walls, more than I've ever seen in my career. But we have a long way to go, just as most of corporate America does. So I think we're in this moment where people ask me why this moment is different, and I don't think there's any one clear answer. But I have one of the things that I know the reason why this is different is because of students at MIT. It's because of the millennial generation and whatever's next. Why? I got to keep straight, right? And the next generation. And the reality is the younger generations, unlike baby boomers and Generation X, which I am, have a greater connection to equality and have a belief that it's simply not right. Right. And so as Eastern, we've tried to really advocate for a long time about right and smart and talk about the smart reason to be diverse in terms of driving business, engaging your customers, generating more revenue. Like that's how we've tried to go after it from a corporate lens for a very long time. Like, okay, we believe it's right. Whether you think it's right or not, it's a smart from a business sense. And so that's really been our approach. The reality is that smart piece has never been more true than it is today. But we also have it's just the right thing to do that has raised in preference in the communities. And as I said to my fellow bankers in that audience, your largest workforce are now millennials. The largest wealth transfer in the history of America is about to take place over the next 10 to 15 years because all those baby boomers are going to give all their money to the millennials, right? And whether you've gotten on board yet or not, you need to get on board now or you're going to be irrelevant a decade from now. And so all those things are coming together, Malia.
That's right. That's right. And I think that that's also a really important thing for us to remember is that it is good business because millennials, folks who are inheriting this wealth, they don't want to walk into a white shoe firm, right? They don't want to be treated the way their parents, did. They're not going to be buying buildings in the same way, and so it's important that capital responds. We have another question from the audience around CRA. Which is the Community Reinvestment Act, and and really, and thinking about the CRA and other policies, how can we lean into CRA, or are there more policies that would be, I'm saying great, although I'm sure there would be a bunch of pushback when they got instituted, but are there things around policy that could help drive different capital, and I know banks are regulated by the FDIC, but I'm sure investment funds, right, also have some type of regulation. Do you guys see policy as playing part of this answer? And Barbara, we can start with you and then we'll jump to Quincy.
Yes, because we've seen I think we have to have really thoughtful policies because we saw, I think what a failure PPP was. And I think part of the question too on the CRA, and I'm no expert on that, but, was dealing with CDFIs. And just the fact that, we didn't really think about small businesses when it came to relief, the Relief Act. So, where are they banking? Who, for example, so many small businesses use some of the fintech companies like a Cabbage, to get funding, and they weren't available in the first round. It was just this total lack of awareness of, what the climate is like, what the ecosystem is like. So I do believe there's a lot of policy, work that needs doing. The other thing too is there's lots of government programs that have goals to fund women and minority-led businesses, and they don't even reach their goals for supplier diversity. And I think their feet need to be held to the fire on that. There's, for example, and some folks, especially this is an MIT audience, some of you may be familiar with the SBIR program, which is sort of the umbrella of all of the different government agencies like National Institutes for Health, National Science Foundation, like the VA, Defense Department, stuff like that. They fund $4 billion, B, into private companies that are innovating in the areas that they care about. And their funding of women-led companies, so, we think about half of all the bachelors of, at MIT are going to women, right? Their rate of funding women and people of color is just atrocious. And what's the oversight on that? That's the Congressional Small Business Administration. I mean, so that's a policy thing where you can't just say, hey, we want to fund these people, but oops, we didn't do it this year. And I know there was another question in the chat about climate change. I mean, what did I hear somebody say yesterday? This vaccine, this COVID thing is a walk in the park compared to climate change, because there's no vaccine for climate change. We need the most diverse, innovative teams and companies, and we need to support them. We can't be doing business as usual. Diverse teams outperform monoculture teams. That science is done. We know that. So why would we waste our time continuing to perpetuate monoculture, funding monoculture teams, funding monocultural ideas? We don't have time for that. We've run out of time on culture, on climate change.
And we've run out of time on culture too, Barbara. I don't think that was a misspeak. Yeah. I think, right? I mean, we're at this day of reckoning now, right? And that's the conversation. George Floyd's murder highlighted that we can't go on with the racism in our country and in our institutions as well. Quincy, I know that, you obviously think about CRA a lot and, think about policies that can hold our feet to the fire. Are there any out there that we should be calling our senators about, or, how are you thinking about policy to help hold you and the industry accountable?
Yeah, well, again, that's another thing that I've heard talked about more now than in the past is policy changes. I mean, listen, banks are regulated more than almost any industry. I know maybe, health firms, but and so if you think about our regulations, let's use CRA example. So there's a lot of discussion right now in Congress about revamping CRA because it hasn't changed in, 30 some odd years, right? But CRA today still is very much driven by physical location. Well, if you look at the banks who closed out of communities of color decades ago, and you then overlay that onto CRA requirements today, well, if they're physically not sitting in that community, they don't have any CRA requirements, right? And so the question becomes, should the CRA requirements be a measure of where you're doing business, not where you're physically sitting? Right. And that's only going to continue to change. The number of bank branches, the number of banks have dropped consistently over. I mean, I think when I started this career, there were 18,000 banks, and now there's about 8,000 banks. Right. And so that's going to continue to change. So we do have to modernize some of these things to help hold accountable. But a great example of this is, think about a credit score. And this comes to things that we can change through policy and reform, both at the government level and the individual level. But, your credit score is the biggest driver for access to credit from a bank, right? That's what we use. We all use the same credit scoring system, particularly on the consumer side. It's essentially identical. Now, Black and brown people are more than twice as likely to not have a credit score. So by nature, you can't get a loan at a bank because you don't have a credit score. And so as an industry and from sort of from the government regulation perspective, should the regulators look at different ways to assess credit quality or the ability to be able to deliver credit that's not so binary as you have a credit score and is it 710 or better or not? And so those are things that we're going to have to, as we move forward, be more creative around.
Absolutely. I also want to take a facilitator's privilege to tell people that fintech also is regulated differently. And there's actually concerns, like right now, PayPal and Square are sending out, get a line of credit for your small business. And the fear is that fintech can become quite predatory quite quickly because of the lack of regulation. And so that balance is important. Barbara.
Well, right, because if you look at the time period since the previous, 2008 financial crisis, We saw banks, as we said, they exited small business. And so who swooped in? A lot of these fintech companies. So that's why you'll have a company that maybe they've gotten something from Cabbage, or, you know, they've done some other lending and they have no relationship with a bank. Or maybe they picked one of the big banks who have, you know, and they just use them for check writing and they have no relationship. So then when they need a line of credit or something like that, they don't have the relationship, they don't have the history to really do anything about that. And I don't see that as changing much, because let's be real, if in an era of zero interest rates, basically, it does not pay to lend smallish amounts of money to small businesses. It's really, really difficult.
Yep, absolutely. It's going to continue to be. I know that we're coming to a close. So before I give you guys a chance for closing statements, so if you want to think about those, you know, I do want to talk about, yesterday we were having conversation with the Runway Project, which does community underwriting for Black and brown companies in the startup phase. And to your point, Barbara, they give loans about, you know, 20 to 30,000. You don't need a credit score. You don't need these types of things. And one of the things that they were saying is that, you know, we know that 50% of Black and brown businesses have shuttered because of COVID. And if we're going into this second surge, and if we're going to have to shut down the way we shut down first, we're going to really see what I called an extinction of Black and brown businesses. So, you know, this work is more important than ever. And I would just love to hear from you guys on, you know, how you guys are thinking about how do we rebuild, right? I mean, if we have, I mean, in a certain way, maybe we'll, you know, be left with the best and the brightest, right? Because they're the ones who could survive COVID. So we'll end up with the 5 strongest Black and brown companies. But thinking about rebuilding from that, and Barbara, when you're saying your statistics about how, you know, Black women started more businesses last year, right? It seems like we were going on this momentum, and then COVID sort of was just a brick wall. And so I would love to, you know, get your thoughts, you know, both Quincy and Barbara, around how do we rebuild, knowing the losses are going to be devastating for the Black and brown economy. And Quincy, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so again, I think one of the things it's going to take is you know, greater community support and coming together. But I do believe that, you know, this pandemic, as in with every recession, has created an opportunity for business owners to be innovative and redesign themselves. And this is really where their own entrepreneurial capacity comes in and helps to create some sort of haves and have-nots, unfortunately, in this environment. And I can think of, you know, 2 restaurants in Greater Boston that I know, both Black-owned. One, if you, and I usually only call there on the weekend, but if you call there on the weekend, it's a 3-hour wait to get food. That's how swamped that they are. They're like, we'll call you. I've never heard this before. They're like, we'll call you back when your food is ready. It will be ready in a couple hours. And then there's another restaurant who has no one showing up at it, right? It's how they figured out how to respond to this pandemic and be creative. And unfortunately, as you look across this, you know, there's never been something as widespread impact as what COVID has had, and to your point. And we're just now beginning to see, I think, the real impacts of that. And that's why another relief package is desperately needed. The short answer is we need another relief package. We need to make sure that that money, and I'm glad there's more conversations about this, gets to the places that's needed. I am hopeful that when Congress hopefully passes this, they make it simpler for the small businesses. Barbara mentioned this. I mean, honestly, it took us more work to get a $10,000 loan approved than it did to get $1 million loan approved, right? Yep. And part of that was the requirements that were put on the banks that we had to do, and then how we had to walk our customers through, like, oh, no, you did that wrong, right? If you ask, and this is one of the little known things, particularly for the smaller customers, and I hope that other banks did this. We had so many customers who applied for the wrong amount. They applied for too much money. They didn't do the calculations correctly. What we did was we walked through them one by one and recalculated it with them, which was not a requirement of the program. But we did that because we said, you're not going to get this forgiven when forgiveness comes around because you're asking for the wrong amounts. Right? And so hopefully the stimulus that comes out, it's clear enough and simple enough that the smallest businesses, and particularly the businesses of color, can easily qualify. It was designed to be a grant anyway. So make it simple. All the fraud that's happening is happening at the much larger space, not at $10,000 a time. So those are some of my thoughts.
That's right. That's right. The fraud was happening at the $1 million, right? If you're asking for $5,000 for your little entrepreneur, your little one-person company, you're not going to be defrauding the government. Barbara, how do we rebuild at this time? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I have a ton of concepts or things that I think about in my head. One of which is, most small businesses, if we're talking about small businesses, even entrepreneurs, I mean, they are basically sole proprietorship. And so we need to focus on helping the individual. And so that's where I really feel like this relief package needs to be giving individuals money, and not necessarily trying to prop up, especially all of those companies that got money and they have different kinds of access to capital. I mean, if you have 500 employees, you have a lot of different choices rather than if you are like a two-person shop or a one-person shop. So I sort of throw that out there. The other is, before the pandemic happened, we had one of the most colossal collapses, which was WeWork. When we think about institutional money that was destroyed, value was destroyed when the valuation, it started here and it went down. And, I thought that was an interesting time because here we have the situation where you have banks and, and other smaller investors wondering whether they should invest in these small companies. And we had some giant checks that went, we had institutional money that went down to zero. And I think we're focused on the wrong things. We need to be focused on, we know that the default rate in communities of color is not higher than in other communities. In fact, it's lower. And so we need to realize that these are actually really good bets. And then we shouldn't even call them bets. I mean, they're good investments. So I think we need to just realize that what's holding us back is our bias and our, and institutional racism, because these folks, especially when we get to those companies that are $500,000, $750,000, and then $1 million, they're still small. They still need a lot of support, but they're very good investments for our community. And so we just need to, as Ayanna Pressley says, we need to, the people who are closest to the pain should be part of the solution. So we just need to be listening to those communities. Our infrastructures are for an olden time, which, just like we were just talking about with CRA, where you physically operated mattered. Well, we can work anywhere we want, and we can, we're so much more mobile, that some of our systems are just really antiquated. And so, but I'm also not very positive about making change because it is really difficult. So I don't know.
Well, and now's the time. I mean, I think if there was ever a time to make an argument for a holistic, right? We got to do everything from institutional systems, individual. It's now as all of our vulnerabilities are laid to bear. So I would love to just end with some closing comments around, anything that you guys are working on now that, that we can get in, or just any closing thoughts. And I also want to say that I am taking the liberty of sharing a piece that I did for Banker and Tradesman around how banks and financial institutions can leverage the infrastructure. And so that's my contribution to how we move forward. But Barbara, any final thoughts for students, faculty, and alumni on what we can take away and actions that we can do moving forward?
Well, and I think that's like, I'll just take it full circle and back to the very opening remarks by Fiona, where, we want to go from unconscious bias to conscious action. And every single person on this call can do something to change the way they are interacting in the world. I realized, if I just go along with the way this is, I'm not seeing the diversity that I want. So what can I do to change it? And, I'm just one person, and I just decided I was going to change who I was meeting with. It takes a while, but then you're like, and now I'm at the point where I never have meetings where there's not a wonderful, diversity of the people attending. And, sometimes maybe I am the only white woman in the room, and that's not a bad thing. So anyway, so everybody has that power. You don't have to look to I'm waiting for somebody to change this or whatever. You can totally do that yourself.
Yeah, I would just echo, that was going to be Barbara stole exactly where I was going with that. That was going to be my point, right? Which is it's taking action. And, listen, when it comes to businesses, right, the lifeblood of all these businesses is sales. Think about yourself, your network, the connectivity, word of mouth, still the most profitable marketing you can possibly do. You can take individual action just in your own purchasing behavior, and not even just yours, but your friends and family and relatives, right? That's what the reality is. That's what these businesses need. And when you're supporting one, you end up supporting the ecosystem and back to the ecosystem. Sort of the supply chain is really the word I was looking for through that. And it is about taking an anti-racist approach, right? And being outwardly supportive of how to drive equity, whether it's in business, in health equity, in education, et cetera. All those things will drive changes across and be supportive for our business communities.
Thank you. And thank you both. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you liked this, our next conversation is going to be January 14th, and we're going to be talking to folks who are creating new funding models. So these are new ways similar to the Runway Project doing community underwriting, but really trying to change the systems and give us new systems that we were talking about. And so that'll be January 14th, and you can see the link in your chat. I want to thank both Dr. Murray and Dr. Regans for this conversation and our ongoing conversation. I also want to thank Patsy, Lauren, and a lot of folks who you don't get to see who have been behind the scenes helping us make these first 3 conversations a success. And with that, just everyone have a wonderful, wonderful holiday, and we'll see you January 14th. Barbara and Quincy, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Bye-bye, everyone.